Hello, everyone, and welcome to the DISC Masterclass that I will be teaching. These Masterclass sessions are actually yet another result of agent feedback and agent-led company behavior. There's many times that I'll be teaching something, or I'll be on a stage, or I'll be on a podcast, or be in front of a group of agents, and somebody says, man, I wish this was recorded as a class. And as we started thinking about it, there's so much talent inside of this company, both in leadership and at the agent side. But one of the proudest things I have about this company is the level of practitioner-based knowledge in this company. Everyone who holds a C title, an SVP title, VP title, the vast majority of them are practitioners and practitioners at a high level. So this is how this was born, just another idea that agents gave us that we were able to execute on. And I had to teach the DISC class, the DISC and personality profiles, and being deeply aware of who you are and how you're wired has been one of the best kind of very important decisions that I decided to become very well versed in. So I want to teach the DISC. So welcome to my masterclass. We're going to be going through the DISC, how to understand it, how to apply it, how to adapt to it, how to lead with it, how to sell with it, and how to best make yourself faster, stronger, better, which is a sentence I use a lot. So let's just jump right into it. What is a DISC? DISC is a personality assessment profile. It's a behavioral profile. So the first thing I always want to tell people when I'm talking about any of them, whether it's DISC, AVA, Myers-Briggs, Strength Finders, is that these aren't right or wrong. This is actually, to me, one of the first steps in deeply understanding how you're wired. And this is super important. I'll talk about it throughout, but if you guys have ever heard me do a keynote, typically during Q&A, someone will say something. And one of the, very strong opinions and suggestions I have is that you get a deep understanding of who you are. And as you guys go through this, and I'll explain them all, you'll understand that if you have a deep understanding of how you're wired, and sometimes I call it your God-given gifts, you will be then able to know what things to lean into and potentially what things might not just be the best fit for how you're wired. So let me walk you through them, and we can start with the D. So the D is one of the four categories. And before I go further, I'll just explain, it's a finite amount of points that are assessed to somebody. And when you take the test, you'll rank and D, I, S, and C. And you'll have your natural state and also your adaptive state. And so this will give you a balance and understanding of who you are when you have energy and who you are when you don't have no energy and low energy. And when I talk about energy, I'm not talking esoteric crystals and, essential oils. I'm talking about how you show up. Does something drain you or does something give you energy? And that's how I think about this. So the D part of the quadrant is respective type to dominance, decisive, results orientated. For anyone who is curious what my DISC is, I am a 99D, 99 I, and 10 S and C. So I am through the roof on the first two quadrants that we'll talk through. I'm very, very low on the last two quadrants, the quadrants that we'll talk through. And I'll tell you how that affected my career and how I built systems to respond to other, necessary skills and traits that may not come naturally to me. So by the way, when I took this test for the very first time, I was in my early 20s, and my D was not nearly as high as it was. It was actually right around the 50% range. So it's important to note, I think your DISC can change over time. For the most part, it doesn't change easily. And I've read a lot about this subject, and I've spent a lot of time looking at DISCs. They typically change when you're younger, and they'll typically change during very emotional, traumatic, life-forming moments. So my D went up dramatically through the financial crisis. And I had to kind of sink or swim and adapt. So these folks are challenge result orientated. If someone has a high D, they typically want to be compensated with no guarantees, meaning commission, bonuses, have a challenge-based, results-based compensation model. So if you're working with high Ds and they're your team members or your employees or your customers, it's very important that you get to, a direct question with concise answers. Confidence and independent thinking is very, very important. High Ds have an extremely high risk tolerance, and obviously there's ranges in everything. But high Ds will bet the farm. And I think there's seasons to gambling with your livelihood and what you put on the line. And when I was younger, I would bet my net worth quite often, versus now that I'm a husband, a father, I have folks who are older, my tolerance for risk is risk adjusted. And these folks are problem solving and results oriented. If we move on to I is where I was always a high I, and my I stayed pretty constant. This is, influence, interpersonal skills is another way I hear the I be referred to, but, highly social, enthusiastic, persuasive. So these folks are really good salespeople. I rarely have met a super successful salesperson that doesn't have at least an I above 50, and most of the time are in the upper quadrant between 75 and 100. So if I were to bet, I would say there's a disproportionate amount of licensed real estate agents who their dominant trait is the I. So this would be your leading indicator. So these folks get energy by being in social circles. They tend to be the life of the party. They can get you super excited with an idea or concept and literally get you wrapped up in the feeling of it, in the emotion of it. And by the way, none of this stuff is right or wrong. They're just how human beings are wired. So creative, spontaneous, expressive, super optimistic. They always think it's going to be better tomorrow than it was today. They are inspirational to others and love inspiration. So this was my leading indicator when I was younger. During the financial crisis, it came down a little bit. And again, when we look at the adaptive state of your profile, and your adapted state is basically when you're low energy or towards the end of the day, or you've had a rough day and you're not in your natural state, my I drops by half and my D stays where it is. So one of the things that I think that you benefit tremendously from understanding the DISC and who you are is how you show up to the world. So perfect example. I like people. I like being in front of people. I like being with people. There are days on my calendar where I'll do 3-4 podcasts. By the way, I've done 2 so far today before recording this one. I have an interview with a national media outlet later on today, and I will be talking to agents. By the time today's over, I will actually have a lot of energy. I'll be high energy. Later on this week, I have a finance review that happens quarterly. And I'm going to look at numbers for 4 or 5 hours a day, lots of spreadsheets, lots of detail. I lose energy on days where I'm using my S&C, and we'll get to those next, just because that's not where my natural state is. And by the end of the day, my I will drop because I will be using a part of my brain and my personality that's not in my natural state or my preferred state. And so what that means, at the end of the day, I may show up different. And even as you get well-versed in this subject, be hyper aware of how you show up to the most important people in your life, your personal life, how you show up to your loved ones. Because what pains me to see is when someone works really hard all day, and you're doing that for your loved ones, but then you show up very different for them than you do for everybody else. And it could be received very differently. So another thing to super note when someone's a high I, they relish the human interaction. So they may not be short-winded. If you have a very specific talk track or information you need to deliver an I, and you only have 5 minutes to do it, that might be tough, right? My D is more dominant. So we can have 10-minute meetings, we can have 15-minute meetings, and we can jump right into it. I had someone show up to a call with me the other day saying that I have a legendarily high D, and that they were just going to jump right into it and give me all the facts and figures because they knew they didn't have a lot of time with me. So that's actually a super important and awesome way to communicate with others, whether it's your spouse, your team members, your customers, because once you get really well versed at this, you can almost figure out who somebody is and know how to approach them. So moving on to the S is steadiness, right? I also refer to it as stability. So S's and C's tend to be really good at detail and operations. So, these people are patient, reliable. My best processor on my team when I sold real estate was all S, right? She was the calm in the storm. She dotted every I, crossed every T, valued stability, offered it, was a calming presence, really good listener, really good at building relationships with the title companies and the loan officers, and kept everybody on the same page. But perfect example, let's say the team leader is a high D, which is not uncommon. And in their best effort to share, opportunity and revenue, they build an incentive program where they tell the processor, who's all S, hey, you're going to have a super low base, and I'm going to make this a variable compensation, and you're going to get, a couple $100 per file. And the D is leading with empathy and love and building a more inclusive mousetrap that supports someone's ability to make more money. But the way it shows up to the S is terror and fear, because this person is really, really motivated by security. And so, they're also motivated by harmony and calmness. So if someone is very intense, that can come across as confrontational, that's not the best way to approach an S. And so, you have all these different personalities in your teams or your offices or your coworkers or your customers, right? Like if you can identify that the seller or the buyer is an S, you have to be patient. You have to come with detail and be supportive and calm in your communication style. So moving on to the fourth quadrant, which is the C. This is conscientiousness, which I describe as detail-oriented, right? So a high C is analytical, detail-oriented, systematic. In my experiences, super high Cs tend to be accountants, CFOs, controllers, FP&A folks. And again, depending on where it's paired, like I've met super high Cs that their second strongest one is a D. So like I connect very well with a DC in finance because I speak details, but they're also rapid. So, a lot of very common opportunity you see is to have S's, or a common matching is S's and C's together. So it's really understanding which way things are paired and how they're paired. But if you're having a conversation with someone who is analytical and you come with no plan and no detail, it will come across as you're unprepared, right? Because if you don't speak the language they understand and can relate to, it makes it very tough for them to actually think you're serious, right? They're very independent thinkers. They're quality oriented. They're detail oriented. And they will be turned off and not, impressed by someone who isn't familiar with this. So if we move along to the conversation, the very important part is understanding that everybody has some portions of these characteristics in them. And some are more pronounced than others. Some are more detailed than others. And it's really important to be adaptive. Where this was a game changer in my life experience is when I could start reading people and how they are and how you need to show up. So one of the cardinal rules of selling is being able to match and mirror people. What do I mean by that? So it's statistically proven in psychology tests that if you show up to someone who's here and you speak much faster, more aggressively than them, at a different tonality and voice, they will think you're probably not trustworthy and a snail goal salesman trying to get one over them. Velocity, tone, speed, everything like that, blah, 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 blah. If you speak below them, if you speak really slow and apathetic and calmly below them, you come across as either not knowledgeable or just, you don't get it. You're not adequately prepared for the conversation. So the goal is to always speak to somebody the same tonality, the same level of sophistication in the vocabulary, and show up in a way that reminds them of themselves, because that creates instant rapport and a confidence in who you are. So if you take that selling principle to heart, what you could do with the disc is so much further, right? The way I would normally do that, and again, this is something that, I'm going to talk about how to apply to real estate, but it is really, really important to understand that this is something that if you internalize, you can apply to all interactions in your life, whether it's clearly for work, but also with your children, your parents, your partners, your friends. And once you understand who they are, you can adapt your communication style, your listening style, right? If somebody is a super high D, and there's been exchanges in the past where you resented them because you thought they were being aggressive or didn't show up right, and you just understand how they're wired, you could have a lot more understanding and grace. One exercise we used to do in my team is I would have everyone take the disc test and then print it out and post it by their desk so we could see it, and you knew how to interact with them and you knew how to show up with them. I think it creates much stronger relationships. It creates a much more satisfied client because you spoke to them in a way that they're wired. Again, if folks understand how you are wired, and for example, I'm an extremely high D with not a lot of time, with lots of pulls on my time, and the folks that interact with me show up in a clear, concise, short manner, which again, if you're all I, that feels rude. It feels like you didn't take the time to appreciate how somebody was doing or respect them as a person, right? So there are parts of your natural state that if you don't actually do what's important to you, you're worried you're going to disrespect somebody else. And so a lot of, miscommunication or kind of missed opportunities are actually born from a very good place. Nobody was trying to be rude or disrespectful or hurtful. But then you may show up incorrectly or differently than somebody wants you to show up. And then higher conversation rates, right? Like if you're working towards a transaction, whether it's prospecting or building rapport, for a higher level relationship, if you show up in a way that is the way they like to speak and the way they like to show up, you'll have better quality conversations. So now moving on to the next part of this conversation is applying this to real estate, the most important thing. So first of all, become a student of who you are and how you're wired and how you show up. And there's a couple of reasons why this is super important. Once you understand what you're predisposed in your brain's wiring to do, it actually creates much better ways for you to lead gen. For example, if you're an extremely high I, you will find cold prospecting difficult because you're super human focused and people focused and conversation. You hate rejection, just right or wrong, doesn't matter, but that's how you're wired. So maybe cold interactions where you're hearing rejection constantly is not your love language. But if you're a high I, networking is your jam. Putting yourself in situations that for a lot of people who don't have that high I are very jarring and uncomfortable. Joining BNI, joining Toastmasters, joining your local associations at your places of interest, your kids' school, that stuff that creates lead gen, in addition to being a good member of your community, you thrive in, right? So first, from a business building standpoint, understanding how you're wired and how to build a business around that is super critical and important. And I would invite people to start there real quick and really understanding how you're wired to be very on purpose and very specific on how you show up, even on the things you choose to do, right? If all you learned out of this class is maybe spend less time doing the things you're not wired to do and either delegate those out, or just understanding that you might show up differently. Like if you do something not in your skill set all morning and then you show up to a lunch where you need to be your best version of yourself, you might be putting yourself in a tough situation. So now how do we, and again, super important once you learn to read your customers. In the next couple of slides, I'm going to tell you how to approach them, but let me give you how I used to apply. If I showed up to a new appointment, let's say a listing appointment, be very intentional. So typically when you walked in through the door, someone said, hey, would you like to see the home? Which is normal process in invitation, and absolutely say yes. And what I was actually looking for more of the tour, because by the way, I'd already pulled comps and was very well versed in what that property's value was for cues and conversation, right? Just by how someone's home is tidied up to, what's hanging on the walls, it would give me questions to ask to probe further to get an understanding of who they were, especially when you have two parties on a deed and you have a husband and wife, partners, whatever the titling situation, parent, child, you're going to have multiple decision makers. And let's say the one who actually is going to make the decision is a different personality profile than yourself. You actually have to work a little harder to make sure that you're showing up in a way that is competent, is confident, and you're speaking a language that relates to them. So I would spend just as much time trying to figure out who and how people are wired. So let's jump right into the first one. So working with Ds, the challenges, they're impatient, they're assertive, they take control, right? So for the folks that report directly to me or interact with me or pitch me, these are challenges of working with Leo, full stop, right? I'm very rapid. Part of it is because I have so much on my plate. So I come across as impatient, and I am impatient. As I've matured through my career and my life, I try to make sure that my challenges don't spill on other people. So I'm hyper aware of how I show up. So even if I'm impatient or feel that I'm not getting what I need, I will still be very respectful. I will still mind my P's and Q's, if you will. But that's an adapted state I've learned over the years. And for folks who aren't well versed in this stuff, may not understand that the impatience, frustration that they feel sometimes is not the other person's fault. It's their fault, right? So I believe in radical ownership of who you are. And so let's say somebody's pitching me a product or idea. I'm aware that my level of frustration or impatience is actually my problem, not theirs. And especially if, let's say they're a C or an S and they're presenting, very methodical, very detailed, but, taking their time because that's just how they're wired. And if someone is D, they're going to be assertive. They're going to want to take control of the situation. So, and a lot of times with these, you have to be assertive and also take control of the situation, which may be against your kind of natural state. So be direct and concise, focus on results, and then you have to demonstrate confidence. When working with the high D, if you don't come across as confident in what you're saying and how you're saying it, they will question your competence. Confidence equals competence to a D. So again, it might not be your natural state, so you might feel uncomfortable, but when you are aware of that, you can actually show up the way you need to show up to win their trust. So moving on to I. Challenges, they're also impatient because, they'll move along in the conversation wherever it takes them. They're also assertive and like control. Very similar challenges with high Is as there are with Ds. Lots of Ds have high I or high I's have D in them. So they're very similar challenges. But the strategies with an I is it's got to be engaging. There's got to be changes in your tonality. If someone's a high I, I would make sure you story tell, right? So less about bottom line fact figure, like you would move through a D really quickly, but actually story tell, anecdotes. Explain to them how you did this for another seller and maybe throw in some personal stories. It's got to be engaging. And, there's got to be as much enthusiasm with the realism that you would need with a D. So it's got to be an engaging experience for them, and simplify the details, right? If you get really bogged down in the details and overly explaining things, you may lose them. And so super engaging, very high interpersonal, but again, simplify the details and make sure it's an engaging experience. So moving on to the S, they can come across as indecisive, right? They're normally more about seeking, agreement amongst many folks. And so they may come across as indecisive. I've met lots of S's who I don't think are indecisive at all. But if you're not used to that personality style, they may seem indecisive. This is the type of buyer, seller, or coworker who may want to sleep on it and think about it. Especially if you're a D, it's like, what do you mean? You just can't make a decision right now. So just understanding those nuances. They're very reluctant to change. So on a team, make sure you guys don't change your SOPs, your standard operating procedures, the way you do things kind of with how the wind blows, because that really stresses out S's. A lot of times they're reluctant to change. So, when we're onboarding an independent brokerage or a team, I'm hyper aware that our integrations team needs to really get their arms around those people, because they're overly cautious and they're reluctant to change. And so it's a very kind of stressful moment for them. Now, provide them lots of reassurance. Be super patient. Encourage involvement so they can collaborate with you in the process. So, if you're trying to get buy-in from S's, make sure that they're going back and forth. And again, as salespeople, as people who guide people through a very important transition in their business, just be hyper aware of this, because you will have to, you could have a husband and wife where one's a high I, high D, and someone's an S and C. And you need to be able to balance your presentation and the value you bring to the table and the way you guide them with both, right? So you have to speak to one in a way that you will be received as competent, right? So with the D, that the confidence turns into competence. But with an S, if you show up with that level of confidence, it could be looked at as pushy or overbearing. So you have to create that balance and understand how everybody is wired. So, and of course, ending with the C, which is consciousness. Again, for me, this means detailed. So the challenges, they will overanalyze. They're going to want multiple feedback loops and inputs and data. There could be a lot of skepticism, right? They could question your competence if you do not come across as detailed and well-versed. And so they could dismiss you. And then lots of reluctance to commit, right? If you can't win them over with the facts and figures and the input of data that is important to them, you will lose them. And again, I've taken the disc many, many, many times in my life. I would say, I come across as extremely high C, which I am not. But that's actually an adaptive skill set I've developed, right? During the financial crisis, and I've started businesses, I've lost money, I've made money. And, it's mostly through painful losses that I've learned that details matter. It doesn't matter that I'm wired in a way that I don't love them, but I need them. I need them as an input point. And so when I approach a C, it's all about providing all the data and then making sense of the data for them, being super transparent. Don't leave anything out, right? If, like, let's say you show up with 3 comps and there's two that you didn't include in the presentation because you don't think they're a fit and they've seen them online, that could create skepticism and that you weren't being transparent. So I would bring every single comp, and even the ones that you don't think are a comp, I would have them there and actually probably explain your process on how you put that CMA together to say, hey, look, these two I know are in the neighborhood, but I did not include them because they were built in the 40s, and your part of the neighborhood's newer, built in the 80s, and so they're not true comps. But I brought them just in case, or the other way around, and then allow them time to analyze. These folks need to actually draw their own conclusions with the data points for input. And that's a super important part of the process. So, if you're trying to move through the information very quickly and you don't give them the time they need, again, they can start making assumptions based on how they're wired about how you're wired, meaning you're being a pushy salesman. Maybe you're trying to get one over on them. So just being aware of how people's wiring affects how they take in the world, how you show up in their world, is super helpful. So thank you all for coming to my masterclass on the DISC. This is a subject I care about deeply, and I think it's been a transformative part of how I interact with people. And again, anything that you can do to give you a better understanding of how you show up to the world. And then the next step is being very well versed in it, so you know how to have folks react in a way that you are adapting to their style, right? If you become an expert in it, but the people around you don't understand it, you still then just have to accept them how they are. And it gives you a new degree of patience. So whether, obviously this is applicable to real estate, but I would encourage you guys to take this type of thought process and apply it to your personal lives, to any interactions, to your parents, to your loved ones, to anyone you have a long interaction with. So thank you very much, and I'll see you on the next one.